Welcome, everyone. Good morning to many of you, and maybe even some good afternoons, I think, depending on where you are. If you're across the pond in Europe, it'll be definitely afternoon. And if any of you are calling from Asia, it would be very, very late. Welcome, welcome. Portland, Maine. Oh, beautiful, beautiful place. Welcome, Deb. Fabulous. Yeah, feel free to put it in chat where you're calling in from, because it's hard to know. I love looking at backgrounds on Zoom calls, despite the fact that I don't have a background other than the logo. I think as we get back into the office, we're going to miss this variety of trying to guess where you're calling in from. Oh, sunny Frankfurt. Yikes, great. Welcome. I'm calling in from northern New Jersey, by the way. So Antoinette calling in from New York City. I'm not far from you. Chicago. I'll be making a trip there shortly. One of my favorite airports ever. It would be the O'Hare Airport.
Yeah, not mine.
I was being facetious. Oh, Northern California. Wonderful. Gail, how are we doing in terms of numbers? Most everybody who registered, I think,
we're good. Yep.
Yeah. I think we should get started. It is 11:03. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Jeannie Diefendiefer. I am the CEO of Higher Ambition Leadership Alliance. And the Alliance is a CEO-sponsored, CEO-centric organization of what I would describe as practitioners of higher ambition leadership and leading their organizations and their communities with purpose and values, and always practicing deep listening in everything that they do. And we are delighted to have you join us for our third quarter Thought Leader event with two incredible guests, which I will introduce shortly. As you saw when you joined, we'll be recording this event so that others who could not join us will have an opportunity to view and listen, as well as you. If you want to ever go back and re-listen and watch, you can do so as well. So as we all know, and it's not a surprise to many of you, effectively leading with values is a foundational requirement, honestly, for anyone seeking to realize our higher ambition leadership practice. And in this interactive discussion today, Dr. Gentile will help business leaders to take values-driven action using a groundbreaking research and approach through what we call, and what she calls, giving voice to values, which is very aligned with everything we do at the Alliance. So 3 how-tos that we'll focus on is how to turn good intentions into positive outcomes, how to not to be committed to the right values, but to know how to say and do the right things. Not always easy, having been a leader for many years, and how to not only know what is right, but how to make it actually happen, right? This is sort of not going beyond the words and putting it into action. Giving voice to values was developed by Mary Gentile, who is a board member of the Alliance, as well as a veteran of Harvard Business School and the University of Virginia Darden School of Business, and a pioneer in both ethics and diversity management curriculum. Giving voice to values has been shared and or piloted at well over, get this number, 1,300 educational and executive settings on all 7 continents. Mary, I don't know how you do it, but thank you for joining us. This is fantastic. And we're also joined by Vicki, and Vicki is the partner at KPMG, as well as principal of ethics and compliance group at the firm since 2003. She is responsible for the development of a multi-year ethics and compliance learning and communication strategy at the firm. Obviously, she's developed the firm's first US and global codes of conduct, including setting up the ENC hotline. She has designed and led the rollout of the ethics and compliance reporting system at the firm, established a process for monitoring personnel involved in internal investigations for potential acts of retaliation. And prior responsibilities include developing and managing a compliance monitoring for auditor independence, CPA licensing, CPE compliance, and other related activities. And we are so super excited to have you, Vicki, join us to talk about all the great stuff you've done with giving voice to values at KPMG today. So the agenda for the day is Mary will start with introducing voice to values concepts, and we'll have a short presentation for about 20 minutes. We will follow that with a Q&A. So please listen carefully and have all your questions ready to go, because this is as valuable as how much we all interact with one another on these important topics. And then we will go on to Vicki Sweeney, who will also talk about how she has been able to employ giving voice to values at KPMG and all the great work that she has done with this concept and teaching methods at her firm. We will follow that with some more Q&A. And again, please bring your questions to bear. And then Mary will share a couple of cases of giving voice to values. And then we'll have an interactive dialogue and a wrap up. And that will take us right to 12:30, I'm pretty sure. And we'll manage time. We have a bunch of people doing that. So if you see a soft hook coming your way, you'll know the body language around that. And feel free to put all your questions and thoughts into the chat box. And let's get started. Off to you, Mary.
Thanks so much, Jeannie. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you who were able to attend today. I know it's a warm summer day, and I'm grateful that you're sitting on Zoom. Perhaps some of you are outside. Anyways, I'm delighted to have a chance to share Giving Voice to Values with you all, and especially under the auspices of the Higher Ambition Leadership Alliance, an organization that I feel very proud to have joined last year the board for. I think what I'm trying to do with Giving Voice to Values, or GVV, as I refer to it, is very much in alignment, as Jeannie said, with the Alliance's objectives in terms of helping organizations achieve not just financial success, of course that, but also to achieve their own sense of values-driven purpose. So with that, let me tell you a little bit about what Giving Voice to Values is. It's short line. It's a new approach, an innovative approach to values-driven leadership development, okay? But I always tell people, if you daze out, I know we all listen to Zooms all day these days, if you daze out at any point and then come back in, this is the main bottom line that I hope, if you don't remember anything else, please remember this, that Giving Voice to Values is about asking and answering a different question, a new question when it comes to values and ethics in our organizations and in our wider lives. So the typical question we tend to ask is, what is the right thing to do in any particular situation? Of course, that's an important question. It's one that I'm sure we've all dealt with in our lives in various circumstances. But Giving Voice to Values is about a different question. It's about asking and answering the question, once you know what you believe the right thing to do is, how could you get it done effectively? What would you need to say and do? In what sequence? In what context? What will the pushback be, the objections? In GVV parlance, we call those the reasons and rationalizations that you're likely to hear. They're powerful, but they're fairly predictable. And how would you then respond to those? And what data do you need to gather? And do you need to reframe this challenge? And would you do this alone, or do you need to build a set of allies, a kind of coalition? And is this a one-off situation that you just need to deal with? Or is this more of a systemic problem? If it's a systemic problem, it needs to be addressed systemically, but it doesn't mean that we can't address it. It simply means we need to think more incrementally, more long-term, perhaps more tactically, in terms of how we begin to address it. So again, if you don't remember anything else, remember GVV is about asking and answering that different question. So let me just take a step back. I'm going to very briefly give you a sense of why I developed it this way, and a bit about how it's used and its impact. And if you're interested in learning more, obviously I think you've received URLs and emails, and feel free to contact me. But basically, this work, as I like to say, grew out of my own personal crisis of faith. I had been working in the field of values-driven leadership development and business ethics at leading business schools like Harvard and Darden and Babson for several decades. I'd also been working with companies in a consulting basis. And a number of years ago, back in the I guess it was the mid to late 90s, I just had this sense of disillusionment and despair. It seemed to me that what we were doing was at best futile and at worst hypocritical. And I had that feeling for a number of reasons. I can share some examples if you like. It seemed like every time we would develop a new program at whatever organization I was working with or MBA program I was working with, it would seem that after a few years we would run into another spate of scandals and the whole process would start again. But I had this kind of watershed moment back in the late 90s. I was invited to be on a panel. It was a kind of a debate that was set up by Kirk Hansen, who used to run the business ethics program at Stanford Business School. But when he left Stanford, he went to run something called the Markkula Center for Professional Ethics at Santa Clara University. And he decided to set up a debate. And he was going to have the question was going to be, after a quarter of a century of good faith efforts to try and address values and ethics in business and in business education, on the one side of the debate, there would be, we haven't made any progress. And on the other side of the debate, we've made a lot of progress. And on the negative side, one of his speakers was Milton Friedman's son, who's also an academic. So you can begin to imagine what that was like. He asked me to be on the side of the debate arguing we'd made a lot of progress. And I guess I said yes too quickly, because when I sat down to write my notes for my presentation, I had this moment where I thought, can I lie on an ethics panel? Because when I really tried to think about it, I was thinking, geez, what can I honestly say? So I wrote something kind of nuanced, where I said, well, any of us who've been in management or in education know that there are individuals we've had a positive impact on. But if I was really going to try and think more broadly, I couldn't say that we'd made that much progress. And that was kind of a watershed moment for me. I thought, well, is that really how I want to spend my time? But I think the deepest reason for my crisis of faith is what I actually saw in conversations like this, whether they were in corporate settings or whether they were in educational settings. And it was this, that whenever we would talk about ethics, we would usually share some sort of case study, some challenging situation, and people would read it, and then they'd come into the room with an idea of what they thought the right thing to do was. That wasn't, always so complicated, but in the course of the conversation, two things would happen. The first thing that would happen is that everybody's thinking would become more complex. They'd realize maybe I didn't have all the information. Maybe this is actually kind of standard operating procedure in this industry or this part of the world, or this function. Maybe it's, maybe it's wrong, but if I try and do something, I'm not going to be successful. I might make things worse. I actually think that's a good thing. I don't want people to walk into these situations naively. I want them to think in this complex way. But the second thing that would happen was more troubling. I don't know if you have this experience in your organizations, but I would find in these conversations that there were always one or two people that when they speak, everyone would turn to listen to them. They might be the most articulate or the ones who always had a witty example, but whatever it was, and in corporate settings, they were almost always the person of the highest rank. But whenever they would speak, these were the folks who were usually saying something like, I know what you want me to say, Mary, but in the real world, it's just not possible. So what I was thinking is, people were walking out of these conversations both more confused and less empowered. And I thought, really? Is that what I want to spend my life doing? Life is short. I want to do something that matters. So I just took a step back from this work altogether and started to work on other things, as a consultant mostly, and an educator. And around that time, I had a number of experiences. I won't tell you about them today, just to keep it short, but all of them led me to begin to think about these conversations and these training situations in a different way. I guess the major thing, I interviewed a lot of people, gathered many, many stories about people who had encountered values conflicts at work and how they handled them, for good or ill. And I interviewed people at every level, people right out of business schools to C-suite executives. But I also looked at the research, and I'm just going to share briefly a couple lessons I got from the research. We'll talk about some examples later. But the first thing I'll say is that I remembered some research that I'd seen back when I was still at Harvard Business School. It was two different scholars, Douglas Hunneke and Perry London, and they decided they wanted to study what they were calling moral conviction, people who acted with conviction in very high stakes, high risk situations. And they were doing qualitative research. So what they did is they did in-depth interviews with folks who are often referred to as rescuers from World War II. So these are people who put their own lives at stake during the Holocaust in order to save others. And, they did these interviews to try and find out, did they have any common backgrounds or education or life experience? And what they found is that there were some common characteristics. And the one that stuck out for me was that they said that all of these people at an earlier point in their lives had the experience with someone more senior to them. So a boss, a teacher, a mentor, even a parent. They'd had the experience of rehearsing out loud what you would do in certain kinds of moral conflict situations. And they had this experience at both the cognitive level, but also the behavioral level. So at the cognitive level, they named the values that matter to them, and they put words to it, an articulation, a script. But at the behavioral level, they had the experience of literally voicing it out loud to someone more senior to them, who stood in as proxy for the kind of person they might need to speak with in the actual circumstances. So I was struck by this idea that there was both, that there was this rehearsal and prescripting and coaching. So I looked at the research, and this was about 12 years ago. There was starting to be a lot of research in many disciplines that supported this idea of prescripting and rehearsal and coaching. There's actually more now. But in the field of psychology, you've probably seen some of the research on habit formation. Or there's also a group of scholars who study what's called positive deviance, people who deviate from the norm, but in a positive direction. And they have a really nice phrase, which I'll quote for you. It's their phrase, but I think it captures a lot of what I'm saying. They say that if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, rather than asking them to think their way into a different way of acting, it's more impactful to have them act their way into a different way of thinking. Now, think about that when you think about what often happens in ethics training, which is what I call rules, but no tools, or preach and pretend, preach to you about what's right and pretend you can do it. And so I thought that was interesting. And then there's been research in cognitive neurosciences talking about brain plasticity and creating new neural pathways, again, through this idea of practice and habit and rehearsal, repeated behavior. But the quick story I'm going to tell you, which I think really captures this, comes from the field of kinesthetics, or the study of physical movement. So back in the day when I was working at Harvard Business School, I decided to take a self-defense class. I had never felt the need to take one until I went to work at HBS, which may tell you something. But in Boston, there were a lot of these courses, and they pretty much taught you the same thing. They teach you the physical moves, fist to bridge of nose, or heel to instep, or knee to groin, and you'd practice them in the air. And the idea is now you know what to do. But there was this class that I took was called model mugging. And it was based on an idea called specific state muscle memory. Those of you who are athletes will be familiar with this. And they would bring in a gentleman in a padded suit, and after you'd learned these physical moves, he would come in and attack you, and you had the chance to practice real time because he was protected. And the idea was that you were creating this kind of muscle memory. And so I started thinking, could you create a kind of moral muscle memory? Which led me to the creation of GVV, which is based on a different kind of teaching technology. Instead of just traditional case studies, I used to run the case writing program at Harvard. I was very familiar with those. I think those are great. And they teach you how to be aware of issues and how to analyze issues, but they don't necessarily teach you the third A, which is how to act on issues. And so my GVV cases, I call them the GVV thought experiment. And so they present, they're very short, they present a situation, but they end with a protagonist, as you saw in the cases you read for today, who already knows what he or she thinks is right. And the question isn't to debate what's right, but actually to literally create an action plan and a script for how to act on this effectively, and to anticipate the objections that you will encounter, and then to think about how to respond to them. And this, again, is based on research. We know from behavioral ethics and other psychology research that people tend to react to values conflicts, not by sitting down and doing a pro and con list, but typically we react emotionally and automatically and even unconsciously, and we justify our action post hoc by convincing ourselves it was right or that it was the only thing that we could do. So what I'm trying to do is to shortchange that. I want to literally rewire that automatic response. I never ask you, what would you do? Because if I ask you that, that automatic response will kick in. Instead, I ask, what if you were this protagonist who knows what he or she thinks is right? How could they be effective? Triggers a different part of your brain. It creates a different set of possibilities and creativity. You're getting some more arrows in your quiver. And our cases are all based on real situations. They're always disguised, but we do try and share strategies that worked. And if they didn't work, we give people an opportunity to think about what might have worked better. So that's the GVV thought experiment, which you will have a moment. I'm going to conclude now and just say that this is all based on 3 reversals, 3 flips. The first is what we talk about. Typically, people, when they talk about ethics, will focus on the very thorny dilemmas, the gray areas. Those are important. They teach you to think rigorously. But I find that it leads to an endless conversation about how many angels dance on the head of a pin. And there are a lot of situations where most of us, not everybody, but most of us actually would agree about what's appropriate or legal or fair or just. But nevertheless, it's not always easy to do it. And so lots of rationalizations kick in. So we tend to focus on the so-called clear-cut issues so that we can get people to step past the issue of debating and get to debating about action plans and scripts. So that's the first flip. The second, and literally it actually makes you better at dealing with the gray issues because you're better able to think about options and to talk about these. The second flip is who we think we're talking to. Used to be I'd go into a company and they'd say, you know, most of the people here are good people. We've just got a few bad apples and they're the ones this is for. But I think of our audience as a bell curve. This is based on some research by the late Greg Dees and Peter Crampton. And so at one tail end of the bell curve are the folks who would say, they'd identify as opportunists. And they'd say, they define opportunism as people who would say, I'll do whatever maximizes my self-interest, regardless of values. Now, nobody falls into one of these categories all the time, but these are people who would say that's their primary motivation. And the other tail end are the folks who would self-identify as idealists, the ones who would say, I'll always try and act on my values, regardless of what it means for my self-interest. What we premise is that the majority of us fall under the bell. I put myself there. We call them pragmatists, and we define pragmatists as people who would say, I would like to act on my values, as long as it doesn't put me at a systematic disadvantage, which is not the same as saying, as long as I know I'll succeed. It's not the same as saying, I know I'll never pay a price. It simply means I think I have a shot. So if you define your audience that way, I don't think I have the power to change the opportunists. I think we'll always have them. And I'm not so worried about the idealists, except I would like them to be more competent. But we're really focusing on those pragmatists and saying, we want to give you the literal scripts and action plans and the rehearsal and coaching and the positive examples to be who you already want to be at your best. So I'm not trying to change you. I'm trying to empower you, to enable you. And the final flip is how we do all this. And I already described that. Instead of asking what's right, we ask, how do you get the right thing done? That's GVV in a nutshell. I'm going to stop here, and I hope you might have some questions. I'm happy to share with you how many companies have used this in different ways, how we've used it cross-culturally, which has been quite interesting, some of the challenges that we've faced, anything that you might be curious about. I know I did this 100 miles a minute, but I hope that that was clear. So thank you. Are there some comments or questions?
Any thoughts, questions for Mary? You can use the raise your hand function, or if I see you on video, you could simply raise your physical hand. Mary, as people are kind of thinking about their experience, so one of the things I love about the term giving voice to values is when people talk about ethics and all the ethics training I've taken as a leader, right, in my corporate days, it seems simpler to talk about because we always use vignettes and examples where these, to your point, the situation is clear, right? The behavior is clear and you can kind of identify. But when you talk about behaving according to your values, now you enter a space where so much is dependent on situational behavior in terms of how you treat others, how you treat how you treat circumstances. And reading Jeff Salad in the first case brought me back all kinds of memories in my corporate days about these sort of sticky nuance situation where you, to your point, you really, even as a pragmatist, you have to think about, these are my values. I know how I should behave and the decisions I need to take. But there are consequences potentially, some real, maybe some imagined, right? That people play the movie in their heads. And they watch. I'm amazed at how leaders in hierarchical organizations, even maybe some of them not, we are influenced by what we watch and who we watch, right? And depending on where you put that hierarchy and value to those relationships, I'm always struck by what I would call the pack mentality behavior of leaders who tend to lean towards what's acceptable and what's culturally allowed. And without even using those terms in their heads, their behavior naturally leans towards what is safest in the environment, which helps or influences us to be on that slippery slope, right? And reading one of the cases for me, it's never about, oh my God, if I do this, this is a consequence. It's always about, well, it's sort of like a white lie, right? It's like, well, I do this, it's sort of, but not really. The impact is not great when I think about the consequences, and therefore it should be okay. I'm gonna kind of stick to the status quo, the usual behavior I know that's accepted here. What can one do to continue to develop that, what I would call courage muscle, to stay close to the line of your values as much as possible? And many times for a lot of leaders, their values are aligned with stated corporate values, right? Because most values in corporations are very similar in my mind, all right? And it's the point you make about how do you actually act upon them? What advice or observations would you offer?
Right. So it's a great question. There's a number of key things that were embedded in there, Jeannie. So I'm going to start with something that you mentioned at the end, where you talked about this kind of courage muscle, I think you called it. A lot of people will talk about GVV is about, or not just GVV, acting ethically and responsibly is about moral courage. I actually want to reframe that. It's not that I don't think courage is a good thing. Obviously, it's a great thing. But for many people, it feels like a high bar. And so what I'm talking about is what I call moral competence, because the idea is that if you do this approach that I'm talking about, this rehearsal, this pre-scripting, this practice, especially doing it with your peers, where you are not asked to come out and say, I think this is wrong. You're actually asked to put yourself in the shoes of someone who already has decided it's wrong. So you're kind of given cover, and you get to develop an ability to talk about these things and arguments, but in a safer space. And you're also then building this habit. I know this both from research, but also from my own experience doing this work. I'm an introvert and I don't like arguing with people. And I just have found that over the years doing this, I have found my way of communicating so that, for me, it's easier to ask questions, but I've found that I can ask questions now in a way that will often keep the conversation going beyond the assumption that this is just the way that you should do it. And you also talked about this sort of pack mentality. And of course, that's true. And it's true no matter where you are in the organization. Your pack is different if you're lower level or mid-level or senior, but the pressures are similar. They're just different context. And so I remember, I used to do this work, and when I was working with people who were junior, they would say, and even I would often see this with MBA students, they'd say, I can't do this. I'm too junior. I don't have the legitimacy or the networks. When I get to be senior, I can do this. And when I would be in convenings of CEOs with some of the work I used to do with the Aspen Institute and others, the CEOs would say, it'd be much easier if I were lower in the organization because I have so many stakeholders dependent on me. It becomes very challenging and very difficult. And people in the middle would talk about being squeezed from both sides. Now, what I point out is that all of those explanations, arguments, concerns, they're all true. They're not exaggerating. But the fact is that nevertheless, we find people at all those levels who do this effectively. They just do it very differently. So you're going to see in the two cases we have, one of them is someone very junior. The way she did this, when we tell you how she ended up doing it, or maybe you'll all anticipate it, was very different than the way that the newly promoted corporate controller acted in his situation. They have different levers they can pull, different degrees of freedom. And the last thing I'll say about how you develop this is that there's 7 pillars of GVV. I'm not going to go through those now. We don't have time, but one of them is called self-knowledge and alignment. And one of the things I learned from all the interviewing we did was that if you are a certain kind of person with a certain set of skills or a certain level in the organization, whatever, people do this very differently. There isn't one way to do this. I used to think you had to have courage. You had to be very assertive. You had to be someone who didn't mind arguments. I was none of those things. You had to be a risk taker. I felt myself as risk averse. And what I found is that actually people who were more like me also did this. They just did it very differently. And so we have cases where we feature people who did this in different ways so that people can develop a skill that plays to their strengths.
I love that. So we have one question from Eric Pickney. How do we counteract the imagined perceived consequences?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And actually, we'll see I think in both our cases, actually, we'll see that. I think I recently read a book by Timothy Snyder. He's a historian at Yale, and he talks about, what did he call it? Anticipatory obedience. And I thought, what a great phrase, what a great phrase. And and he talked about how it can be a cause for a lot of really negative behaviors because we're anticipating the worst. Now, we're doing this for evolutionarily effective reasons. We're trying to protect ourselves, right? It's automatic. It's not because we're bad people. But that's why simply preaching at us not to do that does not work. In fact, there's been research that suggests that you teach people about all these habits of mind that we engage in, and what happens is, this is Max Bazerman, what happens is that people will now recognize these behaviors in other people, but we're still vulnerable to it ourselves. We don't see it in ourselves. And so that's why I believe GVV is really an effective strategy for that, because I don't ask you to engage that muscle that's, where you start to feel afraid. I say, I'm not asking you what you're going to do. I'm going to say, here's someone who's made this decision. How could they be effective? So what we're doing is we're triggering a whole different part of your brain. And we know from research, people are more creative when you bring the stress down, right? And so you're giving people that opportunity, and you're putting them with peers who, instead of the peer pressure being, like the Milgram experience, instead of that, the peer pressure is we're all trying to prove we're smart and come up with a strategy for doing the thing that everyone says is hard to do. And so by practicing that in this permitted situation, even required situation, the GVV thought experiment, you're building this muscle memory. And that's how you begin to counteract that anticipatory obedience, because you also are exposed to lots of different ways that people did this effectively. So you start to realize more is possible.
Yeah, I do love that phrase. Russ, you had a question.
Yeah, so Mary, I think this is so, as Jeannie said, this is such a foundational thing for being a purpose and values-driven leader. And such important work, and the focus not on just the intellectual piece, but on action. I guess one of the questions that came up for me was, we're in such a time of polarization, right? And if I think about a lot of the things that are going on externally and even in companies, you have people who strongly believe they know what's right, and they're polarized, right? And at some level, what you have is people essentially, absolutely clear that they have the answer, and other folks. And I've seen this play out. I mean, I'll give one example. In medicine, for example, my wife is a primary care physician, and there's this huge tension between, say, primary care physicians who are really concerned about patient care and doing the right thing, whatever it costs. And then you have a set of administrators who say, yeah, that's right, but there are a whole set of issues around economics and affordability. And each of them sees the other as naive, not getting it. They both see themselves as ethical people, right? And so at some level, I guess the question I have is, you were saying, well, the issue isn't not knowing what's right, it's how to do it. But at some level, if people aren't open to say, well, maybe the truth is more complicated, or there's an opportunity for me to learn more or get to a both end solution, it takes you at a different place. So I'm just curious about that relative to, again, the issue of being clear about what's right and acting on it. I could imagine it leading to, I'm going to get this done, and not necessarily being open to, well, maybe there is different data. Maybe I don't fully have all the information. Maybe there's a both end solution that in some sense respects my values and something else. So just curious about your sense of it.
Yeah, that's a great question, Russ. And there's so many different pieces to that. So the first piece I'll say is that what you were kind of concluding with is the both and solutions, and maybe I don't have all the information. That's actually the process of GVV is about getting to that when it's possible. It's not about being self-righteous. It's not about whistleblowing. In fact, it's about trying to make it so you don't have to blow the whistle. It's not about shaking your fist and speaking truth to power. In fact, you'll see in the solutions to the cases that we're giving, that's not what happened, and it's really about actually enabling people to think creatively. Sometimes I get criticized because people will say, well, the solutions didn't involve someone telling someone they were wrong, but my view is that that's not always going to be effective. In fact, it's often not effective.
Right.
So the idea is, in fact, we have a set of questions, a protocol we work people through where they identify what's at risk or at stake for all the affected parties, not to do a stakeholder analysis, because as I said, you've decided what's right, but rather to understand how could I frame this in a way that is going to mitigate the risks I may be asking them to take, or may at least acknowledge what I'm doing. And then what are the objections I'm likely to face? And then how would I respond to this? We have steps we work people through. And what happens is that then if you are in fact misinformed or underinformed, that will become clear when you walk through these steps. But quite often when we frame it as what's the right thing to do, walking through an analysis enables you to justify anything. I call it a schooling for sophistry. And I have some examples of how that can happen. And so by starting from, and as I said, these are not those gray issues that you're talking about. They are in fact issues where there's something pretty clear. But what I found is that, in fact, I remember doing some work at West Point a few years ago, working with the center at the Army that does all the ethics and leadership training for the 1.3 million enlisted and civilian Army professionals, and they wanted to build GVV into their training. And so we had these conversations, and the guy who was running the program said to me, you know, it's really interesting when you talk about this, because he said, I've been working in here for quite a few years. And when I started, there were a lot of issues that we would have said, yeah, that's clear, that's black and white. We know what the right thing to do is. As time has gone on, people increasingly describe them as gray. And it's not because the issues have become grayer, it's because people feel less empowered. And so that's a way that we kind of justify. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't gray issues. There are lots of gray issues. But for example, you gave the healthcare example. I work with a group called the Aspen Ethical Leadership Program in Healthcare. And we bring together chief medical officers and physicians and nurses and medical companies, corporate leaders every year for 3 or 4 days. We identify leading challenges for them. And there always are lots of complexities. But what we do, they have them discuss them. And then when they get to a conclusion about what they think is the values-driven position, then we apply the GVV methodology, because just because they've decided what they think the right answer is does not mean that it's easy to implement it.
Yeah.
So you kind of need both aspects of this. So anyways, those are a few thoughts about what you've said.
No, that's great. That's great. Well, also, Mary, it just sounds to me like some of the process that you talk about people asking questions and so on, in some sense, lower the bar relative to people's ability to have a conversation, right? It's safer, right? I mean, you know, it's
Exactly.
both the right thing to do, and it also creates space to us threatening to the other person. It really creates a path forward that just
Exactly. It gives them permission. We say, what if you were this person? I never ask people, what would you do?
Right.
Because if you ask them, what would you do, that psychological process that Jonathan Haidt and others have identified kicks in. And we only answer with what we think is possible, because we don't want to live in that space of cognitive dissonance when you know something's wrong and you do it anyway. So instead, I ask, what if you were this person who knows what they think is right? How could they get it done? And the goal is for people to walk away feeling like they have more choices than they thought they did.
That's great.
Love that. Thank you. Thank you, Russ and Mary. So let's bring in Vicki Sweeney to the conversation. And Vicki, we would love to hear about your work and journey at KPMG with GVV.
Great. Well, thank you. And it's such a privilege to be here with all of you. And I'm just thrilled to be with Mary today and share some of the stuff that we've learned along the way. I'll start with the usual disclaimer. The views that I express today are my own and not that of KPMG. Most of you probably know KPMG is a large professional services firm in the United States. That's the firm that I'm a partner at. 37,000 employees, a couple thousand partners, and we provide audit, tax, advisory, consulting services to our clients. And so, as you heard earlier, I am in the ethics compliance group. And at this point in my career, I've been responsible for a large portfolio of ethics training and communications and other kind of related activities. I'm an attorney, I'm not an accountant. But with that in mind, kind of jumping into GVV, I agree wholeheartedly in working with Mary for a few years that most of our professionals really know the right thing to do. But I think the hard part is when they're facing pressures. It's very difficult. And as was touched upon a little bit earlier, it comes with personal risk, right? When you think about it at any level that you're operating within our firm, very hierarchical, and the risks are there and they vary by level. So what really I think is important to understand, and I'll just reemphasize what Mary said, is that GV focuses on how to get the right thing done. And it's really very pragmatic, it's very tactical. But what it involves is really practice. And I think that what is important is to recognize that it needs to be implemented as part of a longer term strategy for learning, for leadership development. You know, I don't know what everyone on the call does or what your role is, but it's not a one and done. I think that what GVV has done is provide, at least in our firm, an opportunity for learners to practice how they'd speak up in real situations that they face at work. And for leaders, this is also important, is they get to think through how they can best hear the hard or the bad news, the speak up news, right? You know, when somebody says, do you have a minute, right? We all know what that means, right? So as we built a portfolio of courses, we focused on ethical decision making. You know, you want people to make good decisions and you want them to be able to speak up. And I think the speak up is really skills based, right? Not everybody knows how to do it. And so what we did was we started with some web-based training courses. You know, we're in COVID and, you know, that's the best way to roll out training to 37,000 or more people. And that was good and it was effective in the beginning. Web-based training, we got good evaluations and feedback. People were interested. But then we knew and realized quite quickly is that it's live training that really matters for people to engage with each other and really understand, you know, what you're trying to accomplish through training courses or programs. And so what we did was during COVID, we had some what we call VILTs, virtual instructor-led training courses. So we had general sessions and then breakout rooms, just like everybody else was doing, but it gave learners a little bit of an opportunity to interact with each other. So we did that, and then we paused for a minute to say, you know, is this working, right? Do people understand what it is we want them to learn and what we want them to practice? And what we learned is that it wasn't working too well, right? So you've got to admit that. You've got to be realistic. You got to be honest with yourself and the big cross-functional team that's really working hard towards the same objectives. So we paused and we figured out, well, what could we do to make this different? What could we do to make this better? And Mary knows because we've spent several hours brainstorming, thinking, and saying, you know, what's missing here, or, you know, what's different than the other training? And I'm not a training person. I'm a lawyer. Like I've only done, like, before this, like an hour ethics web-based training course every other year or every year. Like, so eyes wide open. I brought in the best people I could meet and work with. And, you know, you really just tap into the strengths and the knowledge of instructional designers, researchers, people that know our firm. And so what we ended up doing was building what we call our GVV Master's Program. And there was a need for it. And we had a problem we had to solve. So we put together what we would call right now, like sort of a 6-week program, but it's a very flexible 6-week program. Through this program, and please don't think you have to take somebody out of your office for 6 weeks and it's like they're on sabbatical. No, we spread it over time. And I think there's opportunities to be very flexible in how you would build a program, but there's a couple of components. First is Mary spent hours on camera on our Teams meetings for the participants, a cohort of a dozen or so. If you can bring more people in, that seemed to be about a good size. And she really taught them the GVV Foundation. The version that you heard today, just quite a bit longer and more opportunities to dive deeper and really help people understand the methodology. And then what we do is we have the individuals create case studies. They can do it individually or in pairs. Then they facilitate a case and have it get feedback from the cohort that is part of your GVV Master's Program. And the feedback comes in the form of your couple of members of your cohort who act as like the learners, some good and really helpful critical feedback from Mary to help people really understand what they got right, what they could do a little bit better. We thought that this program worked pretty well. We tried it the first time and then we regrouped and we thought, well, what could we do to make this a little bit better for the people that are going to go through this program? And one of the things that really helped was to have a cross function of people from all over our firm. They weren't the learning and development people. Certainly that was a handful of people, but we had people from our audit practice, our advisory practice that were in the field. They understood clients, challenges, the team dynamics in a professional services firm. We had a couple folks from our data and analytics team. They were like, well, we're building training, but we really need to understand what you're doing and the ethics side of this and the skill building. So we had people from our tax practice, our tax learning, all kinds of folks that I just sent an invitation and said, hi, could we talk about this? Are you willing to invest some time and effort? And if you can't do it, is there someone on your team or someone that you know? So it wasn't a firm-wide sort of, do you want to be a part of this master's program? It was a little bit selective, and we needed people to be committed to it. We needed them to say, we will go through the program. And so that worked. And then when we regrouped for another cohort, we thought, well, maybe not everybody needs to know every single part of this program. So version 2 invited people to spend a couple of sessions with Mary and me and a couple of my other colleagues to learn the methodology. That's really important for people who are leaders in the firm and are going to be communicating about ethics and values. And that might be the only part they participate in. This is our second go through. Then the next phase of it is creating a case study. And that part we debated, well, maybe not everybody needs to create a case. And then we thought, that's silly. How could they learn the methodology without actually rolling up their sleeves and creating cases? Some people did it in pairs, some did it individually. They came up with real life scenarios and situations. And my observation is that they were well prepared. They were really committed to doing this. Some of them created cases that were just really complicated. And so that was the first phase of kind of giving some feedback on the cases. I see Mary smiling because some of these cases went on and on and on. We're like, no, if you just simplify a little bit, you'll learn more. And if you want to use this case study later, it'll just work better. And that was not really an easy message to deliver to people because they were pretty set on their case studies. But in any event, what we've ended up doing is building a good library of our own case studies, which is kind of nice. And so people can teach their own, or they can teach one that somebody else created that we've gotten into really good shape, very teachable. And then the critical piece of this is that when we initially had the VILTs, we learned that the facilitators were very good facilitators for accounting, technical issues, tax issues, all kinds of stuff. We have a very rigorous program, T3, Train the Trainer, but they really needed the depth and the experience and the skills to learn the GVV methodology. And that was missing for us. So the third component of this is really learning the ins and outs and the technique to be able to really facilitate these cases and do it well and stay true to the methodology. And I think that based on the feedback and some conversations I've had after, it's kind of life-changing for these people individually, because they're thinking about things very differently in how they navigate personal or professional issues for themselves. But they also go into a classroom. We have a huge training facility in Orlando, Florida. They walk into that classroom, they are prepared, they're well equipped. They are not afraid of the questions that they might be asked. They have engaged learners, and it really works for them to have gone through this program. So now if we're running live programs in Lake House in Florida, the first thing we ask is, have you been through the GVV Master's Program? Because they need that. They need it, and they need to spend the time and invest in that so that they are in a position to deliver to leaders. Some of the courses are leadership courses. Others are milestone courses like new managers or new in charge. New in charge in an accounting firm is a big deal. So we have teams, successful teams speak up, and then we have others that are more geared towards leaders so that we can be sure that they're creating the right environment. and people come right up to the microphones. They've got questions. They really enjoy being in this. Well, compared to some of the other training, I think this is pretty interesting. I don't know what they would spend the whole week doing at Lake House, but this should be, sort of the highlight of how they're spending 2 or 3 days. So again, the cases, the custom cases, I would say I'd highly recommend that be a part of, if you're considering a program like this, having people roll up their sleeves and really learn how to write a good case and be open to some good feedback on your case could use a little work because this would work better with the methodology. I think that our people were a little too married to the details. I think that would be the nicest way to describe it. So I'll give you just a quick example of one of the cases that we use that we like. It's pretty simple, but I think you'll get kind of what I'm talking about. So imagine you're part of a team. We call them engagement teams that serve clients, and the team meets every week, and they've been meeting for about 6 months, and usually everybody's engaged in the conversation, and you as a director on the engagement notice that there are a couple of people that have dropped out of the conversation. They're present, but they've stopped talking. And you have it maybe a situation where the boss asks a question and somebody answers it, and there's no response. That might make them feel marginalized, right? You can imagine that feeling, probably all been through it. Later on in the meeting, somebody else offers the exact same answer, suggestion, solution. And the leader's like, that's a fantastic idea. And so you could imagine the feelings and the emotions that are going on, within that team. So here's your GVV piece of this, right? The right thing is to talk to the folks that are part of the team and figure out what is going on. Something in the dynamics has broken down. And what could you do given what your role, your level, your concern over keeping this team intact and productive? So what's at stake for you? You might be a little bit concerned about how the leader might respond if you start asking too many questions, or even the individuals that have just sort of checked out. A lot of people working remotely are kind of hanging on by a thread. What you want to do is make sure that people understand that your intention is to create space for everybody to be able to contribute and feel like they're a valued member of a team, and that there might be somebody that's doing something that is perhaps a little inconsistent with your values by favoring a certain person and ignoring somebody else. So we built a case study around that about, as Mary has said, what's at stake and for whom. And as you start to approach the problem, what are the headwinds, the reasons and rationalizations that you would encounter if you were going to bring this to the leader? How do you prepare yourself to do this through the methodology? What are the enablers? What levers could you pull? And then how do you actually practice what it is you need to say to get it done effectively? And as we've talked about, it's not a you win or I win situation. The goal is to have the best outcome for everybody with the least amount of tension. You're still going to need to work with these people, and you really want to make sure that you're still respected, and you're the person that can help create the best environment for everybody involved. So it's kind of in a nutshell. The case could be a little bit longer, but I just wanted to give you maybe like one example of something that you might have experienced, that you might have felt, or somebody might have come to you and said, this team is just, not really working as well as it could. So anyway, that's kind of, I'm just doing a time check here.
No, that's great. It's funny listening to you on the last case. I think I could probably safely say that all of us have experienced that particular situation. I certainly have experienced it personally as I was growing up in the business, but I also, as a leader, observed that kind of a scenario more often than I like to admit. And I love this notion of creating a case study around it because, frankly, to me, it's so common. And we are all very much infused into the situation when we're in it. but we don't necessarily do anything with it other than maybe talking small talk afterwards about, oh my God, did you see what happened? You know, and then it sort of rinse and repeat, right? You see it again and again and again. And by sort of highlighting and creating a case study around that and addressing it with folks more widely across the organization, to me, that has the power of actually, one, naming it, and two, giving a focus to use it as an example, to know that we want to do something collectively to have a different outcome if we want every individual to feel valued within the context of purposeful or value-driven kind of culture, right? So I love that. I love that example.
Yeah. And I would add, we've done this in the context of furthering our strategies for DEI, right?
Yeah.
Having people know and understand that not everybody feels completely comfortable, and there may be biases. There may be so many other things going on with those team dynamics, favoritism for people that have loved to work together, they know each other, and you're the new person. And, you know, that's, you know, very common. There are many people that are at companies for a long time. But as we're striving for greater diversity and building diverse teams to bring their best selves to work and have people further their careers, that's a case study that really resonated with our people at so many levels. Mary did a course with our and a case study with our head of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's very well received. People understand it, they relate to it, and my hope is that as they go through this curriculum and later on when they're together, they can engage in these small group conversations with each other. What did you think about that case? You know, it really needs to drive, you know, some good discussions. You know, the silence is the dangerous part when people won't talk about these things. So
that's great. Thank you. So, Mary, should we go into the cases?
Yeah, I'm happy to, unless anyone has a specific question for Vicky. So
I
maybe
don't see any hands up.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. So feel free to contact me if you have questions. I know how to connect with Vicky. So let's talk about the two cases that you had. I hope you had a chance to read them, but I will just briefly summarize each, and then I'd really be interested in asking you how you would handle the situation, not what's right, but given that the protagonist knows what they think is right, how they could be effective. So the first one, we have two, as I said before. One is from lower in the organization, one's from more senior in the organization. Let's start with the one from the client who fell through the cracks, the Susan, who's lower in the organization. She's fairly new in this organization. They manage the portfolios of high net worth individuals. She has a new boss. Her company's been going through a lot of turnover. And he comes to her one morning and says, I have a client meeting this afternoon. The portfolio of this gentleman has underperformed our benchmark significantly. I'd like you to, you know, come up with a different benchmark and a deck and set of slides that will make it look like his portfolio did better than it did. He's a very unsophisticated investor, elderly gentleman. This is his retirement money that he wants to give to his grandkids. He won't know the difference. In fact, his portfolio is smaller than most of ours, and we're only dealing with him as a favor for one of our senior partners. And so she feels like, that's not right. She doesn't feel good about it, but she's new in the company. Her boss is new to her. She doesn't really have a relationship. She doesn't know if this is like SOP at this organization. So she's trying to figure out what to do. So instead of, you know, what should she do, as in, should she deal with it or just obey, a GVV case ends with, she knows it's wrong, she doesn't want to do it, but how could she be effective given the context? So I'm going to just pause there. I've used this case with many different kinds of audiences, for, you know, young business students, MBA students, executive students. Also, I've used it with a group of compliance people, a group of attorneys. I've used it with many different audiences, and it's amusing how the answers differ, which I'd be happy to share. But I'd love to hear if those of you who read the case or just heard me articulate it, what do you think Susan could do in that situation, given that she doesn't want to comply?
Okay. This is part of the audience participation. We love to hear your perspectives. There are no right answers.
And
Karen.
there's no wrong answers.
Oh, Lee. Is it
Hi,
Lee?
thanks.
Yeah,
Yep,
go
it's
ahead.
Lee. Hi.
Lee.
Thank you. First of all, I find this whole topic very, very interesting, and I actually know somebody who dealt with the situation in the other case. So I probably am predisposed to how that person
We'll
handled
get there.
it. We'll get there.
I'm going to pick on you again.
I think in this case, I would be less focused around trying to tell a different story and just more focused around how to improve the performance of the portfolio moving forward. So focus on, strategies that are more aligned with the client's goals, and not try to go back and tell a different story.
So what would you tell Juan, your boss, when he says, okay, where's the deck?
I think I would just try to reposition it as, sort of what's happened in the past is less important than what's going to happen in the future, and focus on that.
Okay, so you would actually reframe the challenge for him and not just for the, okay.
I guess so.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow, that's actually wonderful.
And in
Anyone
a GVV,
else? Yeah. Anyone else has a thought, a different approach, or even if it's same? I may just call on people. I get to be a professor for a second. Any thoughts?
I think I would ask him, given that he wants to enhance, this portfolio in a way that is misrepresenting it, then I would ask him, what would you do?
Yeah.
I'm at a loss at how you want this to be framed.
Mm.
You help me understand how you want this to be.
so you'd actually be pushing him to flesh out his request a little more. Yeah, and maybe confront what he's asking.
Right, and I think it's safe to say, is to voice that I'm not comfortable reframing something in a way that would be misrepresenting, this gentleman's portfolio, and I'm wondering how. I'm curious.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you would go about doing that.
Right. So that's interesting, Nancy. You're actually putting it back on him to make him confront what he's actually asking her to do.
I'm not comfortable, and I think, and I'm glad you said, reframing this kind of thing like being brave, right? You said it earlier, and it's just about trying to exercise that muscle, or you've developed the muscle for being, having this kind of moral competence.
Right. That's great. Thanks. Any other ideas about how people might do this? When I use this with, sorry, Vicky, but when I use this with attorneys, I typically get little self-righteous speeches, where they kind of refer to the rules or the code of conduct, or, and what I'll often say with GVV is that it's fine. I mean, obviously you want to know what the codes are and the rules, and it's fine to acknowledge them, but that's not enough. We're not just trying to preach at people. We're actually trying to think about how could you frame this in a way that the person you're trying to influence would actually be persuaded. So I think I want to be sure we get to the other case. So I'm going to tell you what she actually did.
Oh, Mary, hold on. Randy has a question.
Oh, I didn't see. Go ahead.
No, that's okay.
Randy, you're muted.
You're muted.
Thanks. I'm not sure. I think my gut reaction would have been just to ask some peers at the company how they might, how have you ever been asked something like this, or just to see if it is systemic, as you said, or if it was just this one
guy.
That just to get some data.
Yeah, data gathering, hugely important. That's great. Well, so what actually happened is she took Randy's advice. The first thing she did is she went and asked a colleague, because she was relatively new in the firm, and she wanted to, is this standard operating procedure here? And the colleague she asked said, no, you're right. This isn't appropriate. But on the other hand, she had the sense that if she just said no, that her boss would simply go ask one of her colleagues to do it, which would hurt her relationship with her boss, not help the client, and actually put a peer in the same difficult situation. So she wasn't sure that was really a solution. What she ended up doing is she went to her boss, before the meeting. It was the same day. A lot of people would say short time frame, you don't have time to do the right thing. You kind of have to just bite the bullet. But she decided to use the short time frame to her advantage. And what she did is she went to her boss and she said, look, I don't really have time to come up with an entirely different benchmark that makes this look differently. But what I can do, and what I have done, is I've created a set of slides, a deck with talking points that explained exactly what we were doing, where we went off track in each situation, and what we're going to do next quarter to address this. And so what she did, she gave him a script. Basically, she scripted him the way I'm actually asking people to script themselves. And what she decided was to assume that her boss was not invested in being unethical. She decided that he was invested in getting through a very difficult conversation. And so she tried to solve his problem, but in a different way than the specific way he asked her to. So from his perspective, she was helping him. She wasn't telling him, you're a bad boy. She was helping him. She was enabling him. And she wasn't sure if he would buy it, but he said, well, okay, I'll try it. And the client, of course, wasn't thrilled that the portfolio had underperformed in the last period, but got it and said, okay, I see where you're going next quarter. And so from her perspective, the idea was, some people, I share this and they'll say, well, but she didn't tell him he was unethical, which is sort of something, Nancy, you were saying, ask him these questions, she didn't. And I always say, well, he knew she didn't want to do it. It was fairly obvious, but she gave him a way to save face, but she also presented herself as on his side. She wasn't there to make his life miserable or to tell him he was a bad guy. She was there to help him and the team perform well, please the client, and do the right thing. So it's just reframing that challenge in that way, something that I think Russ was trying to get at in the earlier question. But now let me tell you a story about someone who is not doing this up, but who is in a more senior role, although actually he's kind of got to go up and down. And this is the case you read called Jeff Sallet from the top, sort of. So Jeff had been working in this fairly large and successful firm for quite a few years. He had just been promoted to corporate controller. And as he was being promoted, he was asked to sign off on one of their quarterly filings. And he thought that the adjustments they were making were over the line in terms of accounting standards and accounting principles. And he did try and talk to somebody, another senior executive in the firm, who basically said, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. If you can't deal with this, maybe you don't belong as corporate controller. So that was kind of a startling message for him to receive. So he doesn't want to do it. But he's also trying to figure out, what do I do? Like, do I do this as my first out of the box action as corporate controller? Or do I wait till I built relationships and some credibility, and do it later? How should I do this? So part of his question is how to do it. And another part of his question is when to do it. So I'm going to pause there, and assuming you all kind of read the case, and see if people had thoughts about what Jeff should do in that situation. Not should as in what's right, but should as in what will be effective.
Any thoughts, ideas, starters?
These are all based on real situations, but disguised.
Which is the best part.
I think because of the role he's in, he can set his tone in his new role in terms of, this is what I expect to see going forward, etc. So I think that there's a place for him to already address it through however he introduces himself to the organisation in his new role. I know he's been in the organisation a while, but his expectations, I think there's a place there for him to do something.
Yeah, that's really interesting to sort of start assuming his new role. And if we were doing a full GVV case, you would be in a small group and we'd be asking you to script that. You know, what would he say? Literally, what words would he say if he were and to different audiences, because he has to talk down, across, and up. Other ideas?
I'll just add to that. I'm sorry, I didn't read the homework. I must miss the email, but
You heard me summarize it. That's
I
okay.
think I get it. And
Yeah.
In my role as a head of HR, this happens often where something comes up. It's and maybe there's a law, a policy, a reason that whatever it is shouldn't happen. And maybe starting with why I'm concerned about that, and maybe not why I'm concerned, because that makes it about me, but why it could be a problem, the explaining the legal background, the risks involved, penalties involved, whatever it might be, the consequences that could happen if we were to not, or if we were to address that incorrectly. So maybe depersonalizing it from my role as the head of, or as a controller might be helpful.
Yeah. So giving that perspective. So that's an interesting one. I think it's always useful to take that broader view and to even talk about longer term. But however, we do know from the research that people, especially in moral conflicts, we know from the psychology and the behavioral ethics research is that people tend to discount those long-term kind of explanations and to overweight the short term. So they're overweighting the idea of what will be the impact on our stock price if we put this out this quarter. And so I always tell people it's good to mention the kinds of longer term arguments and broader perspective, as Raul was just explaining, but it's also useful to have some arguments or some comments or some ways of framing it that help people think about the short term, either how they're going to deal with the short term reaction or what they can communicate that might mitigate the short term reaction. So it's a part of the answer, but I usually think it needs a little more. Anything else? So I unless someone raises their hand quickly, I'm going to tell you what happened because I realize we're running short on time. But what he did, you know, people always say, you know, there's a tendency to think about, you know, should I do this now? Is this not the right time? Should I build the relationships? What he decided is to think about this, to frame this as what will be my situation if I react this way now, or if I decide I'm going to wait and build relationships and credibility and then act. And what he decided is that he was making it harder for himself if he didn't react now, because people will assume he's okay with it. And it will just be, obviously, it's something that's going to happen every quarter if they're, you know, if they sort of have this kind of slippery slope sort of behavior. So he decided that this is the right time. But then he had to think about how to take it. And I think it's somewhat, I think it was Madeline, I think he took some of your advice actually, because what he decided to do was to take the position he was in, to realize I am in this new position. So I'm going to assume that position. I have greater responsibility, but I have also more levers and degrees of freedom. So what he did is he went to the CEO and he said, and he didn't ask permission, he just said, this is what I'm going to do as I assume this role. He explained the situation to him and he said, so what I've decided to do is to introduce myself in this new role. I guess this relates to something someone else said as well. I'm going to introduce myself in this new role as we're going to be stressing attention to integrity in our reporting. And he said, we're going to have a kind of initiative. We're going to call it Integrity is the Bottom Line. And there'll be some training. And what I need from you, CEO, is to communicate this with support to the top 150 folks. I am going to be working with our external auditors, connect with KPMG, for example, as well as with the folks down the organization, and communicate this. And leading with that as his leading sort of, this is who I'm going to be in this role, made it impossible for people to sign off on a quarterly report that was deceptive. And so it kind of gave him cover in that way, but it also established who he was from the beginning. And because he got the CEO to agree to reinforce this, even if he wasn't sure, you know, maybe they've been doing this all along, you know, but it kind of made it a different conversation. So from his perspective, this was the moment to do it, and he had to do it with that kind of confidence. And when I teach this case, one of the things I always talk about is that, you know, you do need to think about where you are in the organization, and you do have different degrees of freedom, and certain things will work better if you're in one position or another position. So if he in a senior position, maybe just asking questions wouldn't work so well. So we actually talk about this in that way, because we don't want people to use the excuses that I mentioned earlier, that either I don't have enough authority or I have too much authority. So we actually help them frame that in that way. I'm going to wrap up because I know we're running out of time. So I want to just tell you that in terms of what I hope you take away from this, what I always tell people is once they're introduced to GVV, I hope the main thing they'll walk away with is a sense that we typically have more choices than we think we do. There's lots of psychological reasons why we think we don't, and why that's a self-protective measure. But we usually have more choices than we think we do. But the way to help us feel that and actually operationalize that is to, in fact, rehearse and practice and prescript. Mm-hmm. The other thing I ask people to do is to think about how they have been successful in the past at influencing anyone about anything. Doesn't have to do with ethics necessarily, doesn't even have to be at work necessarily, but what is your strength in terms of communication? Because almost every challenge can be framed in a way that you can play to your strengths, whether it means one-on-one conversations, whether it means putting something in writing, whether it means asking questions, whether it means building a set of allies, etc. Another thing I ask people to, the key of GVV is this kind of a post-decision making scenario. We always present scenarios where, and the ones that Vicki was talking about, they're always situations where the protagonist knows what's appropriate. And the question is, how can they get it done? So giving people the opportunity in this post-decision making scenario to create a script and an action plan and to rehearse it with their peers. The other thing we have 7 pillars of GVV. I only talked to you about one of them, but another one is called normalization. And it's this idea that these are not exceptional situations. Values conflicts come up every day in every way. And if we think of them as exceptional, there's a tendency to put our heads down and kind of rush through it and maybe just do what's easier and justify it after the fact, as I said. But if we actually think of them as normal parts of business and life, we can bring the stress down, be more creative, rehearse, and practice. And the final thing I want to say is that Vicki described a really innovative way that KPMG is working on this by creating these internal champions who understand the methodology, who do internal training, but also bring it to their own business behavior and practice. But we've worked with this in many ways with many organizations across many industries, whether it's Lockheed Martin in the defense industry, or whether it's McKinsey in consulting, or whether it's pharmaceutical firms or electrical energy firms, all kinds of settings, as well as the U.S. military. And we do it differently in all those contexts. So if you're interested in this approach, I can share with you different models that might work for you. So I'm going to stop there. And I think that Jeannie has some things that she wants to say, but I want to thank you all for being willing to listen and hear a little bit about GVV, and thanks to Vicki as well.
Mary, and Vicki, this was so interesting, and I can't believe 90 minutes is gone, but I could think of so many follow-up discussions, honestly, right? One is just listening to you, Vicki, about the KPMG process, because you are a service organization with many thousands, if not, many, many thousands customers, how we apply this also into the client base. And also I was thinking the other way with a supplier base, right? Because often the hierarchy of suppliers also is suspect in terms of how people are expected to behave or perceived to behave, and how this could really help across the entire food chain, so to speak, so that it's carried through in every interaction in the way a company operates. The other thing I was thinking about is, I think it would be so much fun and valuable to have the GVV conversation in our personal lives. That's a whole nother area. Well, I don't know about you all, but in our family relations and friendships and extended communities, I mean, this also comes to play every day, and how we choose to behave in a certain way without even thinking about it. That sometimes I look back and say, oh gosh, I had that chance and I didn't really, align with what my values are in the way I reacted to that and the way I behave that. And sometimes I think we have a tendency to sacrifice our families more in a way that we think they should understand us better. So they'll understand. They know what I mean. They know what I'm about. But in fact, it kind of builds. And
You know, I was doing a program in Abu Dhabi with Etihad Aviation, and
yeah.
the guy who brought me in the next day, we were there several days, came to me and he said, you know, I had a conversation with my father in Nigeria, and for the first time ever, it was a constructive conversation, but because I used some of the things we've been talking about.
Exactly. And I could certainly apply to my own case. And that could be really fun, Mary. And I do want to say that we will get additional materials, Mary. I love to get the 7 pillars piece and maybe send it to the audience afterwards in our follow-up email. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I hope you found it valuable and thought-provoking and give you some additional things to think about, both in your professional and personal lives. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Again, we'll follow up with an email with some additional materials you can read about and learn from. And if you have any specific requests, just reach out to us and we'll try to curate those for you. And when we ask you for feedback on these sessions, we hope that you will take the 5 minutes and give us feedback and insights as to how we can make these sessions better for you, because you are giving us your gift of time, and we do truly appreciate you spending those 90 minutes with us. I know how crazy busy everybody is. So thank you again, Mary and Vicki, and for rest of you, you will hear from us again for other programs that we will offer. And please do visit our website. Our Refresh website has lots of great information that you can garner from and also learn about what else is coming. Thank you again, Mary and Vicki, for joining us, and for all of you for spending time with us. All right.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.